So we have quite a few folks on. I'm Melissa Schlag. I am Save the Sound's climate advocate. And today we're here to learn about the value of distributed energy, in case you're in the wrong classroom. Welcome everybody. Great to have you here. But before we get started, I have some housekeeping rules to go over. I'll ask everyone to stay muted throughout the discussion. At the end, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. And we'll ask that you use the raise your hand feature that's in the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Or you can put your question in the chat at any time. As you think of your questions, go ahead and throw it in there. Also, we're recording this webinar, so if you want to revisit it or if you have someone that you know that missed it, we'll be sure to share that with all people who signed up for the webinar. And we'll share it via an email to everybody again later, probably next week. And you can also find it on savethesound.org/stay engaged. And that's where you can find all of our webinars and film clubs and everything that's really cool that Save the Sound does. And finally, just a little bit about Save the Sound. We're a nonprofit based in Connecticut and New York, and we do a little bit of everything from legislative advocacy and legal action to engineering, environmental monitoring, and hands-on volunteer work. We restore and protect all the impacts of the Long Island Sound region, including the air we breathe and the water of the Sound itself. So very privileged to work for Save the Sound, and I love all my colleagues who do such great work every day. All right, so let's move on to our panelists. First, we have Charles Rothenberger. He is Save the Sound's in-house climate and energy attorney. Charles focuses on climate policy and legislation to ensure clean air and a robust green economy for Connecticut. He has more than 15 years of experience working on environmental, energy, and land issues, including a previous stint with Save the Sound. He left us and came back, so thank you, Charles. He's well-versed in lobbying before the Connecticut General Assembly, state agencies, and municipal boards and commissions. And PURA and DEEP, especially PURA, has been very busy during the COVID times, so he's been busy. Next, we have Karl Rabago. He operates Rábago Energy LLC, which is an energy consulting firm based in Colorado. Karl recently led the Pace Energy and Climate Center at the Pace University Elizabeth Haub School of Law in White Plains, New York, where he also taught energy law. Karl has 30 years of experience in energy and climate policy and is recognized as an innovator in utility regulatory issues relating to clean energy. Among his many posts, Karl has also been a commissioner on the Texas Public Utility Commission, a deputy assistant secretary at the U.S. Department of Energy, and energy program manager for the Environmental Defense Fund. So welcome, Karl. Thank you for joining us. Next, we have Kyle Wallace. He is a senior manager of public policy at Vivint Solar, primarily covering the New England and Mid-Atlantic regions. Prior to working on the policy team, Kyle worked on Vivint Solar's marketing expansion team, where he managed expansion into 10 states and analyzed solar market potential for all 50 states. Kyle earned his bachelor's degree in political science from the Colorado Mesa University and a master's in American politics and public policy from Utah State University. Welcome, Kyle. And last but definitely not least, we have Sena Wazer from the Sunrise Movement, Connecticut. She is a 16-year-old climate justice advocate who has been advocating for environment since she was 5 years old. So this is old hat for her. She is a co-director of the Sunrise Movement in Connecticut and also serves on the Equity and Environmental Justice Working Group of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. She's going into her junior year at UConn. Welcome, Sena. So what we'll do is I will ask all our panelists some questions. If the audience has questions along the way, like I said, please feel free to put it in the chat when it comes to you. And there'll be some time at the end to ask your questions. So the first question I'll pose to Charles Rothenberger. Can you explain for us what the value of distributed energy resources, PURA docket, actually is, and the policy process that brought us to this point today?
Sure. Thanks, Melissa. So that title of the docket is certainly a mouthful, but really the purpose of the docket is to determine the value of distributed energy resources, and think of rooftop solar. And this really comes out of several years of debate up at the legislature here in Connecticut as a result of really the state's desire to change the way that rooftop solar is compensated. Technically, we're looking to end our net metering policies, which will be phased out and instead move to what's called a feed-in tariff-based model. And as I mentioned, all of that really just means the manner in which owners of rooftop solar panels are compensated for the energy that they generate. So under a net metering policy, which is what we currently have, a customer's meter keeps track of both how much electricity produced by the solar panels is used on site, as well as how much of it is exported to the grid. You can think of it as the meter sort of running forwards or backwards. And if that residential PV system is generating more electricity than the customer is using in a given period, then the customer receives bill credits, which can be used to offset future electricity usage that they're actually pulling off of the electricity grid. By contrast, although a feed-in tariff also compensates customers for the energy they generate, they do it in a slightly different manner. So unlike net metering, which provides bill credits, under a feed-in tariff, customers are actually paid directly for the electricity that they produce. And the real rub comes in about what that rate is, right? This rate can be higher or lower than the retail rate, which is essentially what they're then buying from the electricity grid in order to offset any deficits in what their own system is generating. And then one additional twist. So some forms of this feed-in tariff arrangement are known as a buy-all, sell-all, in which, and this may sound counterintuitive to folks, customers with solar PV on their roof are actually required to sell all of the energy they generate to the grid, and then they have to purchase all the electricity they need back from the electric utility. And again, you can easily see how there could be a discrepancy between what customers are being paid by the utility for the electricity they're providing and what they're forced to pay for the electricity that they're then using for their own home. So, clearly, if Connecticut is looking to transition to some form of a feed-in tariff, it's clear that it's absolutely critical to ensure that the PV owners are compensated for the full value of the clean renewable energy they're generating. So in 2018, sort of getting to the legislative background, General Assembly passed legislation that would have sunsetted our current net metering program, with the current customers who are operating under that system able to continue their credits, continue that system until 2039. And then it would have replaced it with that buy-all, sell-all model, which is really not the best and probably one of the worst models moving forward. So the following year, in the face of that sort of coming down the road, advocates were able to successfully push back and pass a new bill, which managed to put in place a 2-year extension for the current net metering policies, and that will continue through the end of next year, and also push back the timeline under which PURA had to establish these tariff rates and the program design, which will become effective in 2022. And that's where this docket comes into play. PURA was directed as part of that second round of legislation in order to establish this docket to really determine what is the value of solar in the state of Connecticut. The goal here is to ensure that all of the benefits of local, i.e. distributed clean energy, are accounted for when considering what the appropriate compensation rate should be set at. And this includes human health benefits of less air pollution, the climate benefits of displacing fossil fuel generation, as well as those benefits that accrue directly to the electricity system itself. You might think of greater resiliency, less congestion of electrons on the grid, and the need for less investment in costly transmission infrastructure, just to name a few. So this is a really important proceeding which could well determine the fate of solar in Connecticut.
Right. Thanks, Charles. I think it's something that not a lot of us realize. We're so used to yelling at our legislators to do the right thing, and we forget about those agencies like DEEP and PURA, who really take the policy down to the nitty-gritty level and can make huge differences in anything that has to do with our environment. So we appreciate all the diligence you have with PURA, Charles. Thank you.
I think that's a really important point. The legislature acts in very broad strokes. They sort of give the marching orders and the directions, but all of the critical detail, which is really going to determine how effective a program is when it's finally implemented on the ground, is left to the administrative agencies, whether that's DEEP or PURA or whichever administrative agency has cognizance.
Right. Yeah, so true. So next we'll go to Karl. Karl, can you explain what the heck distributed energy resources actually means, and why is this process even necessary?
Yeah, boy. So sit down for a while here, and hope you had strong coffee. No, we're gonna. I'll try to make it as quick as I can and get the high points across because, and Charles actually laid up the foundation for it pretty well. What we're trying to do is trying to figure out what things are worth. And that's kind of hard for a lot of people in the utility business because the utility business has run for over 100 years as a cost plus business, just the same way that defense contracting works. They just, whatever they pay for it, they add a little markup, and that's what we end up getting as a cost. And a few years ago, actually many years ago, before I even started in this business, environmental economists were making the point that if the prices aren't right, and prices in the utility business are set on cost plus profit, if the prices aren't right, if we exclude things of benefit or we exclude certain kinds of costs, then we're going to make uneconomic decisions. If the price is artificially kept low, we'll buy more than we should. If the price is artificially kept high, we'll buy less than we should. And one of the big ones for people who care about the environment is the fact that the value of the environment, the cost of pollution to the environment, or the value of avoiding that pollution with clean energy resources, has not been built into the price of electricity. The economists call that an externality, meaning that cost that is external to the price formula. So back in around 2011, when I was looking at net metering at the city of Austin as a utility executive, we used some calculations about what the value of solar was in order to help us inform how we might set a better price, not just what we'd pay for it in the marketplace, because that wouldn't reflect the carbon value, for example, the climate value. Since about 2010, 11, we've been talking in the electricity industry about trying to get a better understanding of the value of things. An old friend of mine in the utility business said that most utilities, there's only two things they don't know. Number one, what anything's worth, because of that cost plus mindset. And two, what anyone wants, because customers have been forced to take pretty much just anything the utility gives them when it comes to electric service. Another reason why we're approaching this issue now is because distributed energy resources, things like distributed generation, distributed storage, batteries you can put on the wall of your garage if you have one, distributed energy management systems, things to control your electricity usage with great precision and to provide money savings. All sorts of resources that are distributed have become much more affordable and much more valuable because they can help us avoid all those costs and avoid even some utility bills. So just as computers have become ubiquitous and we now hold more computing power than was in the Apollo rocket ships in our own hands with our cell phones, so in the electricity business, finally, we are starting to get more sophisticated and more distributed resources available, good prices with low cost, meaning they have high value. What's been missing are methods and methodologies to make calculation of that value, and as Charles said, to use those value calculations in how we end up pricing goods, services, and importantly to the utilities, what prices should impact what customers do for themselves. And that's the last point I want to make, and we can get into more detail about this in a bit. But this is a big issue because electric utilities see customers making their own electricity or saving a lot of their own electricity, or participating in community solar projects that the utilities do not own as an existential threat to their monopoly business model. It is fundamental to them that they make it all or buy it all and sell it all to you, and that all you use come from them. It's not, it's partly ideology, but it's mostly just economics. It's the business model. And when more and more customers take it upon themselves to make and manage their electricity, the utility revenues, the profits, are challenged. So we've got a perfect storm of interest over the last decade or so. We've got advancing technology. We've got customers wanting to internalize the cost of things and internalize the value of their actions in terms of addressing things like climate change. And we've got utilities facing a fundamental transformation in the way they will have to do business, or else they'll be out of business. So we're trying to use regulatory processes to calculate the value of these resources to better inform regulation, rate setting, market development, and policy overall. So I'll stop right there as a sort of giving you that high-level introduction, and we can dive in a little more as we keep talking.
Great, thanks. Yeah, everything's coming to a head right now. Rubber hits the road. We got to get this right today.
Exactly.
Thank you. Kyle, let's turn to you. From your perspective as a solar company, can you talk a little bit about any on-the-ground challenges that you're facing and what the proceedings mean for the solar industry in Connecticut?
Yeah. So, I mean, right now in Connecticut and kind of generally across the nation, it's both an exciting time for solar, but also a lot of uncertainty. In Connecticut specifically, there's just lots of regulatory activity that's occurring. Some positive, some negative. And so there's just a lot of challenges to the market of what is this market even going to look like 2 years from now, a year and a half from now. And as a business, it's difficult to really be able to grow and have the type of solar deployment that you want when it's hard to make those long-term decisions based on all of that regulatory uncertainty. I mean, it's beyond just the value of distributed energy resources study. We have the successor tariffs to net metering. That proceeding just kicked off, and we'll start going on all of the activity that will have to go into that. There's proposals for energy storage programs, which are exciting, and we're supportive of. And so there's just a lot going on. And when you look at it in kind of the national picture, we have seen equipment costs come down dramatically over the last 10 plus years in solar, but the soft costs have been fairly stubborn. And so we're still trying to work on ways to reduce those costs because, we need to reduce costs to keep the value proposition for customers, the same as incentives like the federal investment tax credit are declining, as the residential solar investment program in Connecticut is going away, as net metering is transitioning. And so there's a lot of those pressures to lower costs to maintain a value for customers that's happening amid all of this regulatory uncertainty. And specifically on the value of distributed energy resources study, I mean, I think this is really important, not only just because it'll help inform the successor programs of what customers should be compensated for the solar they're providing to the grid, but it's also finally in Connecticut a real chance to have good information, hopefully for lawmakers and policymakers, of what is the actual value of renewable energy, because without that, the policies they're trying to make are based on incomplete information. One reason we're in this climate crisis is because for a long time, policymakers have not truly quantified the value of renewable energy, and that they've ignored the externalities that are being shifted onto society from traditional fossil fuel generation. And so that mindset has to change. And I think this study is going to hopefully kind of trigger a paradigm shift among policymakers to further embrace moving away from fossil fuels into a cleaner and more distributed future. And so I do believe that, generally, the legislature, the governor's office, PURA, DEEP, they're all trying to get more renewable energy. I don't doubt that, but trying to find that balance of, ensuring that solar is still attractive, that it still makes economic sense for people, especially for low and moderate income households, that has to be a priority. And as you reduce incentives, reduce compensation, that pushes it further out of reach for a lot of segments of the population. So, it's a balancing act, and, we're excited, but also, very uncertain about what the next few years look like.
Thanks so much, Kyle. That's actually a perfect segue into our next panelist. Sena, you have been fighting for climate justice on the ground for a long time now. You're the lone youth voice on the Governor's Council on Climate Change, which some of you might see as written as the GC3. It's the short name for it. Why don't you tell us your perspective on the importance and value of accessible renewable energy for our future in Connecticut and for the world?
Yeah, thank you. So I guess I would start with something that I think we can all agree on, which is that renewable energy is the future. It's where we're moving. And, as a young person, knowing that we don't have that much time left to prevent the worst consequences of climate change makes me all the more eager to adopt renewable energy as quickly as possible, especially considering, the immense amounts of harm that fossil fuels are doing, to the planet in general, but also to communities all across the world. And I guess I would also note that, climate change is a highly intersectional issue, intersecting with race and gender and class and all these different things. And so solar, renewable energy is one way to hopefully address those intersections, to bring clean air to communities with really high asthma rates, to ensure that folks have access to community solar, even if they don't live in a house that can have solar, right? If they live in an apartment or something like that. And so to me, renewable energy, solar, is a way for us to address these equity issues and, make sure that we do have a future moving forward.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sena. And thanks for your fighting for all the rest of us and future generations. All right, let's go back to the study itself, and I'll ask all of our energy wonks on our panel. What are your key takeaways from PURA's Distributed Energy Resources report? Positive, negative, and I'll just kind of open it up to whoever wants to take that first.
Well, I'll just start with the process perspective, and I'm sure others will be able to get into the nitty-gritty. But even at the outset, I think we all had some concerns about how this process would play out. Connecticut is not the first state that's undertaken a value of distributed energy resources study. And generally, these are multi-year efforts. They tend to be complicated if you want to do them right. And this, it was a legislative fiat, but was set for a very short time window, 12 months really from beginning to end. So we had some concerns that wasn't really sufficient in order to do the sort of rigorous study that you'd want to really have the right results. And then just recently, sort of going from the beginning of the process to just last week, I think a lot of folks were taken aback by the fact that after the draft report had been released, there apparently wasn't any intention to actually provide an opportunity to have a dialogue with the consultant who produced the report and to sort of vet those results, look at how the numbers they arrived at were calculated, and fortunately, and to the credit of both and PURA, they heard all of us expressing the real need and importance of having such a dialogue with the consultant. So they have scheduled one now for August 13th, which is good. Unfortunate that it had to take some strenuous effort to get there, but we'll judge it by the results. And I guess I would just point out one other thing that sort of raises an eyebrow. It's kind of tough to be too excited or have too much faith in a report when the report itself, in several places, as this one does, states that its role in establishing whatever that tariff will be down the road is actually rather limited. Clearly there are other factors to be considered and to taken into account, but it really seems as though if the report is almost apologizing for itself right at the outset. But hopefully, once we engage more deeply with the consultant, there will be opportunities to improve the rigor of the study. But those are my sort of high-level impressions.
Yeah, I think those are good points, Charles. I'll jump in here and tell you. There's a saying that when you've been raised as a hammer, every issue looks like a nail. Every challenge looks like a nail, and your response is just pound it. We've had 100 years of this central station utility model of business in which, you make electricity in big plants and you move it across big wires, and then you sort of narrow it down to your toaster. These distributed resources I was describing earlier change everything. But the models that are dominant in the industry today are models for the big utility industry, and the firm that was hired to do this modeling to try to calculate what the value of these small scale resources are is a big utility model, and it's geared towards addressing things, as if they were all nails. And pounding them with big strokes of the hammer. So there's a fundamental concern about how you approach analyzing these things with more nuance, with more granularity, with more understanding of the interactions between sort of small players on the scene, a much more personal level, if you will, of looking at utility planning and the value proposition. So that's the first big problem. And then look, it's tough. It's hard to do because most of the money is being a consultant to a utility. There's not a lot of money out there in being consultants to little guys. So the weapons, the tools have not been that well developed. Nonetheless, as Charles said, we've been doing value of solar studies across the country and adapting the existing systems as best we can. When you do that kind of adaptation and modify an existing model, the first rule has got to be that you got to show your work. You got to demonstrate what your assumptions are. You got to show how you changed the model, what variables you introduced, how you tweaked the algorithms, the formulas in the model in order to come up with your solutions. So the first big problem was we got a model not well suited to valuing distributed resources. And then the second problem, unfortunately, we noticed is that there's not been a lot of transparency. Thanks to the advocacy of Save the Sound and Connecticut Fund for the Environment, and for everybody championing, all the guys in the solar community and others, we are pushing for more, and we're getting some, but we're fighting for that access along the way. Finally, you have to actually know what you want to do with this. Our goal for this whole thing was that we'd get information and insight that would inform how to fairly compensate, and if necessary, charge customers who took action to invest in distributed resources like distributed solar, or to participate in community solar projects, or to just engage in energy efficiency. We'd have information that would guide the development of those rates that I mentioned earlier on, so that we fairly treat customers and businesses who put it on the line, open their wallets and put it on the line to participate in this clean energy revolution. Unfortunately, the third big issue that's coming up with this modeling is that even after all this work and after all this taxpayer money went into paying these consultants, there's this giant disclaimer in the report about how even though we've done all this, you can't use it. There's much more that has to be done in order to turn it into rates. And well, we know there's some application of the results from any exercise like this. It's highly disconcerting how far the consultants are distancing themselves to the actual use of these results in the processes in Connecticut. And that was what got us here in the first place. We were log jammed over how to treat distributed resources. And the legislature said, well, you got 12 months to solve this thing. And we're a little concerned that we can't really even tell if we've gotten sufficiently close that the results will be useful. So notwithstanding good examples, there are some areas of concern. I will say there are some positive things about the way these consultants approach the issue. And there are positive signs from DEEP and PURA that they are listening to us when, goodness knows, we've been pounding on our end of the table too. But we still have a ways to go on this.
Yeah. You know, I'll add a couple of positive things, you know, that balance it out a little bit. I mean, I do appreciate that they have taken a longer term view of the value of these resources, where that hasn't always been the case in other states that have done similar exercises. Sometimes they'll look at short term, 1 year costs, 5 year costs, and it just dramatically undervalues the resources. And so, I mean, that is one area where they definitely have listened to the feedback and you know, adjusted accordingly. But a couple of my big takeaways, I guess, from the draft report, you know, notwithstanding how some of the values may change after some of the rounds of feedback, you know, even with the current numbers, it shows that behind the meter solar plus storage is incredibly valuable to the grid and to all ratepayers. And so currently in Connecticut, where there is no real energy storage market, you know, if I'm a lawmaker or I'm a policymaker, I'm looking at this report and thinking, how can we get more energy storage fast? It's definitely going to be a key to help integrate more renewables to the grid. And there's a lot of job and economic activity opportunity there as well. And so, you know, really they should be looking at how can we make sure that storage makes sense in Connecticut, make sure that we have programs that support it, that properly value it, and programs like demand response programs and grid services that provide value to all ratepayers. Because the current use case in the report is a fairly simple one of just what are the kind of peak hours, and you just arbitrage to, you know, discharge during those peak hours and save, you know, ratepayers through that. But there's a lot of other applications and ways that you could provide additional value beyond that. And so, you know, even with a fairly limited use case, it shows significant value. And so I really think that, you know, hopefully they take this seriously and really do get a large energy storage program for residential, for commercial, and really try to get the industry to start shifting to solar plus storage as a norm. I think that would be a really good place. And so, you know, there was the bill that was going through the legislature earlier this year before COVID stopped the session that would have set a 1,000 megawatt target of storage by 2030. And, you know, something like that with accompanying programs, which that bill did require them to create and look at some programs for storage. You know, I think something like that would be a really good step in the right direction and help Connecticut keep pace with some of the other states that are making real advances on the energy storage front. And then just a second takeaway is that, I mean, we do think currently the report still is undervaluing solar alone. But I think that even when we get to hopefully the final report with a higher value, I think it'll basically show that, you know, net metering is not significantly overcompensating customers already. And so the need to move away from it or to go to a much lower compensation level, just I don't think will make a lot of sense. And so, you know, hopefully this report does help support economically viable solar in the state.
That's great. Thank you, guys. I think it goes to show, like all of you have mentioned, that it pays to speak up, and they've already extended the docket deadline because of all the questions with the report, or the questions themselves. And a year is definitely a short period of time in the middle of a global pandemic. So it's a tough time to figure out the value of distributed energy right now. And I thank you guys all for keeping an eye on this docket for us. Karl. Kyle, sorry. Can you tell us about the cost shifting argument that has been raised over the years and how it relates to the different levels of solar penetration?
So I mean, it's a common argument from utilities that we see across the nation. And basically, the short of it is that under net metering, the value of the energy you're sending back to the grid or self-consuming is essentially the retail rate that you're paying the utility, so you're just avoiding that energy cost. And their argument is that, the value of that energy really is, typically they'll argue it's closer to a wholesale rate, which is a pretty low value. And they're saying that difference between what you're being compensated at and what that wholesale rate is costs that should be recovered by the utility. That's not. And so it's leading to rate increases for everyone else. It's a very frustrating argument in a state like Connecticut, when over the last couple of years, debate about net metering and ending it was in full force, and no one really actually knew what the value of renewable energy was. And so this assumption that it's only valued at the avoided costs, and thus there's a huge cost shift, was not really supported in any real way. And so I think when this report's done, I think it'll show that there is not some large cost shift occurring from net metering to other customers, especially when you have such low solar penetration rates of, maybe 2 to 3% in Connecticut. It's just not, when you look at even under, a hypothetical scenario where the value is not quite at the retail rate, maybe the value is 15 cents and the utility rate's 20 cents, even if there's a couple cents there, you look at that in the grand scheme of things of what the utilities costs are and what their revenues are, it is so small that it's not significant in any way. And so the laser focus on it is clearly about something else. And so that's kind of, hopefully this study will help disprove that, because if there's a lot of value from this energy, as the report's showing, and hopefully will show even higher when it's finalized, then there may be no cost shift at all. Obviously as you get to higher levels of solar penetration, there is a decrease in, the value typically, just, especially if you don't have storage. I should caveat that. And so, in higher states, or in states with higher solar penetration, like California, Hawaii, it's a very different conversation than when you're looking at Connecticut. And so, I think that the legislature probably jumped the gun in ending net metering and shifting to these new programs, given the penetration levels. And hopefully this study will help us, combat that cost shift argument, because, and then just from an environmental perspective, it's kind of maddening when there have been costs shifted to society by utilities because of their fossil fuel generation for decades. And the cumulative value of that compared to, trying to make that right, it's so insignificant that it can be very frustrating.
Thanks for that, Kyle. It's tough to think that solar panels that is reducing wear and tear on the wires and the grid, that there's no value in that. So yeah. And we've talked a lot about tariffs and net metering, and it can be complicated, but it's really not actually. And yesterday, Karl had a wonderful analogy to explain net metering and tariffs. And so I'm wondering if you could share that with us now, Karl, with the rest of the audience.
So, and Kyle set this up perfectly, because, this cost shift question that comes up. Remember, I said that the way utilities work is that they are cost plus business. So they spend $10,000 putting in a pole and a transformer outside your house, and then they assume that you're going to use 1,000 units of electricity every month, and that's how you're going to pay for that pole and that transformer. Very simplified version of the situation. And then you go and have the audacity to buy an LED light bulb or a solar panel, and instead of using 1,000 units every month, you reduce your usage to 500 or 200. And you invested your own money and you took advantage of your tax breaks, but you reduced it to 200. And the utility is saying, I still got this pole and this transformer, and you were going to pay for that. So I'm going to have to shift the cost of that pole and that transformer to somebody else, right? Now, the thoughtful person versus, well, why didn't you see this coming? Why didn't you build a smaller pole and a smaller transformer? Because we've been talking about solar for, I personally have only been talking about solar for 30 years, but kind of ignored about that. So here's what's going on. You've got friends that are going to think about doing things. They're going to listen to Sena and the people that Save the Sound and other environmental and caring groups and people, and they're going to say, I want to do something. And you're going to try to explain to them that this is something they can do. So I've come up with this analogy to try to help understand. You don't have to do net metering tariffs. You don't have to do any of that to understand. This is really just about homegrown tomatoes. You see, once upon a time, we all had to buy electricity from the company store, right? It was like as if Walmart was the only grocery store that was allowed or even existed in our community, the superstore, and they were the ones that stocked all the tomatoes. And then somebody got out there and they started reading or researching, and they said, geez, you know, homegrown tomatoes can actually be healthy, and you can grow them without pesticides, and they'll be more flavorful, and it'll give you something to do outside. And there's lots of benefits to growing homegrown tomatoes. And the Walmart watches a little of this with just kind of humorous indifference, right? Oh, you silly people. You'll still be coming to me for your tomatoes, out of season at least, right? In the winter when there's not as much sunshine, you'll be coming to me. You see how technologies work with solar? But anyway, and we're running the company store, and we're going to continue operating that. And hardly anybody was doing it because tomato seeds were expensive and people didn't really know how to grow them successfully or whatever it was. Anyway, what happens is that it's become more popular. Word of mouth spreads. Kids ask their parents tough questions. How come we don't grow our own tomatoes? And then pretty soon somebody has some extra tomatoes and they want to give them to their neighbor. And now the store is pissed. I mean, mad, angry, right? Now they're going, wait a minute, you're cutting into our business. And the first thing they say is, well, look, first of all, we have extra shelf space now. Who's going to pay for the shelf space? You get the analogy? It's as if they were the only ones that were going to ever do this. And we ordered too many tomatoes. What are we going to do with those extra tomatoes? Who's going to pay for those? And we were expecting to make X amount of dollars on tomato sales. And now the tomato sales are cratering because you people are growing your own tomatoes. Now, we could try to set the price of extra homegrown tomatoes sold on a roadside stand according to what the superstore wants to sell them for. But it would be hard to compete because homegrown tomatoes are labor intensive. They don't enjoy the discount that comes from having no flavor. They come from a long ways away, et cetera, right? So if all you could get for your homegrown tomatoes was what the superstore was selling them for, well, first of all, it wouldn't be a very attractive proposition. Why should I buy that if I can buy my tomatoes at the same price and everything else I need at the superstore, right? So there's a reason why things that are worth more cost more. There's a reason why they deserve to be paid for more, which allows me to tell you, just a quick aside, my favorite joke that was never told, that gets to this essential difference between cost, price, and value. And that joke is that on the way to the moon, Neil Armstrong radioed back and said, I hope the lowest bidder didn't get the contract, right? He didn't say that. He went on, he landed on the moon. He made that great quote about one giant step and all that thing, one giant leap and one small step and one giant leap. And it would have been kind of funny if he had said it, but it probably would have taken away from that auspicious statement. It would have been like a irresponsible tweet, but he was making a pretty good point. And the point is that when you're hurtling through space, the cold vacuum of space, and everything about your life is dependent on a very small ecosystem in which you must exist, the cheapest solution is not necessarily the best. You want the highest value. And sometimes growing your own tomatoes, even if it takes a little work and a little personal investment, is a better deal. And in most of our society, we've actually allowed markets to help us encourage that behavior. Because in your real life, you can buy tomatoes or grow tomatoes in a whole range of different ways in our communities today. But you can still only get electricity from one company. That's what we're trying to change.
Thanks so much, Karl. It definitely paints a vivid picture of net metering and the cost shifting argument. We'll switch back to Charles now. And other than tomato fertilizer, what are some barriers facing people's access to clean energy right now? And what policies has Connecticut enacted to help with that already? And what else can we do?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll just say thanks, Karl. Now I'm hungry. All this talk about tomatoes. But so a lot of this conversation has been about smaller rooftop solar installations, and clearly one barrier is that in order to take advantage of that technology, you need a roof, and obviously not everybody does. We have lots of renters in the state, folks who maybe have a roof, but for whatever reason it's not well suited to take advantage of solar energy. But clearly, and to emphasize Karl's point, this is a resource that is incredibly valuable, and that we want more of. And as a state policy, we recognize that. But we also want everybody to be able to share in the benefits of this clean, renewable energy economy. So how do we do that? So with respect to solar, specifically, there's a new policy that is being, relatively new policy. We've had a pilot program in place, but a shared solar program, which is poised to go fully live just about a year from today, July 1, 2021. It's also sometimes referred to as community solar. And what this allows for is, modest size solar installations. You can think 25 megawatts, which would be built, and the benefits, the value of the clean electricity being generated would actually be credited to customer subscriber accounts. So Melissa, if you live in an apartment, you could sign up as a subscriber to a community solar project, and as it generates electricity, you're going to be credited a certain amount for every kilowatt hour that's generated. And under the current program design, that would actually come out to be between $13 and $18 a month for the average energy use. So the pilot program is a little complicated. So really great to see that PURA has moved in a really helpful progressive direction on this particular policy. Under the pilot, the solar company building this had to go out, knock on your door, convince you it was a good deal, sign you up, tons of paperwork with our third-party electric suppliers in the state, some reasonable concerns over, whether folks would be getting a fair deal or not. We've had some bad experiences with third-party suppliers, not solar suppliers, but in other fields. So this new program design is actually pretty seamless. For 80% of the generating capacity of that facility, the utilities will automatically enroll you. You don't have to do a thing to get that $18 a month on your off your monthly utility bill. And you can opt out, of course, if for some reason you don't like to save money, that's fine. But the program is also specifically designed and targeted specifically to benefit low and moderate income households as well. So there are 20% of the capacity is reserved for low moderate income individuals, 20% for small business, and then 40% for, again, low and moderate income households, housing authorities, other entities that serve low income populations. And that's all automatically enrolled. And then 20% of that is reserved for people who still fall into each of those reserved categories, but who maybe fall out of whatever particular model they're using to identify potential customers. And you can just raise your hand and say, hey, I'd like to sign up for that as well. So they'll also enroll a portion of that voluntarily. So that's great for the small systems. As Kyle alluded to earlier, we have a lot of stuff going on at PURA right now. There are 9 dockets specifically related to the ongoing effort to modernize our electric grid, recognizing that the electricity world is changing, as both Kyle and Karl pointed out, and trying to find the best ways to integrate new ways of generating electricity, whether it's the large procurement of offshore wind that Connecticut is joining the rest of the Northeast in procuring, whether it's large-scale solar facilities, you name it. So they're looking at battery storage in one docket, as Kyle mentioned, a real good value proposition there. Electric vehicles, how do we maximize the potential for electric vehicles, recognizing that they have benefits for the electricity grid. They themselves could be a potential source of battery storage in some circumstances. Advanced metering infrastructure, taking advantage of our new communication system to ensure that we're doing things really in the most efficient manner. And how all of these things play out in terms of increasing the resiliency and the reliability of the electric grid, another real value that these distributed energy resources provide. And that's just one series of dockets. That scratches the surface. But I think that's sort of a foundational series of dockets. Incredibly important moving forward. And of course, we still have a large procurement of offshore wind to be put out to bid. The state has authority for 2,000 megawatts, which is essentially the size of Millstone. We have one project moving forward, which is about 800 megawatts. So we still have 1,200 to go. So this is all extremely exciting. And of course, these large clean energy projects automatically benefit everybody. Everybody has the benefits of the cleaner air as a result of their operation, and the fact that those electrons flowing to your home are nice, clean electrons.
Great, thanks so much, Charles. Since it is 2:56 and we've had a great conversation, I want to get to Sena one more time. I'll do a wrap up, and then we have some questions in the chat. If you guys can stay a little bit past 3, if our panelists can stay for just a few minutes past 3, that'd be great. So if anybody else has to jump off, again, this being recorded. So Sena, all of this stuff we've just talked about and all the wonkiness, I think you'll have the best advice on this one. You've been boots on the ground again, fighting for climate justice. What's your advice for those of us that want to make a difference and weigh in on this and any important issue?
Yeah, so I guess, I would start by reminding folks that because climate change is such a big issue, because we're on such a short timeline, it's really critical that we are working very closely with these government agencies such as PURA and DEEP, but also with our legislators, the governor, all of those folks. So first of all, reach out to your legislator. I always say that one, they work for you, so they should hear from you as well. But then I would also say, reach out to these agencies. They don't get many comments, on their recommendations. So your comments are essential. They can have a huge impact. It takes about 7 calls for an issue to get flagged as important for a legislator, but it takes even less with DEEP or with PURA. And then lastly, I would say, if you have been giving comments, if you know how to give those comments, talk to people that you know about it, because I do think it seems very intimidating. For me, like, the legislators aren't intimidating. I think people find that a little bit less intimidating, but something with PURA, with DEEP, it just sounds intimidating, and it seems very hard to get involved with that. So host a virtual event, for example, and help folks write a comment to DEEP or a comment to PURA, and help people get involved that way as well.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sena. Wise advice. Speak up, squeaky wheel gets the grease. And like Sena said, PURA is not used to hearing from people. So it's, you make their day exciting. So definitely send in your comments. What we did is we put in the chat the link to how to make comments. But I will be sending everybody on this who signed up for this webinar and on our lists an actual advocacy form that will send a message directly to PURA. And we'll be, since they extended the deadline, that will probably be, it'll be definitely in the next few weeks. It was an imminent issue when the comment deadline was next week, but now it's not so imminent. But the earlier they hear, the better, because they're going to be revisiting the report and talking to the consultant. So that's going to be important. So that link is in the chat. And I'll just do my quick wrap up and then we'll go right to a few questions. I want to thank all of our panelists today. This has been, what I was worried was going to be a wonky discussion was very exciting, and I think our audience got a lot out of it. And thanks to the audience for joining us and learning just a little bit more about distributed energy resources and figuring out what the value of that is. And it's not something we hear about in the daily news. So definitely, as Sena said, tell your friends, tell your neighbors all about this. You can use Karl's tomato analogy if you'd like. He won't charge you. You can catch all of our online events and webinars on our Stay Engaged page. And that, again, is savethesound.org/stay engaged. Laura put that in the chat as well. And while you're on our website, you'll notice a pretty little yellow button that says donate. I know it's a hard time for everybody right now, but if you have the ability to help out, we would be so grateful. Any tiny little bit helps. And thanks for joining us, everybody. This has been great. So for those of you who can stay, let's go back to some questions. Bernie Pelletier asked, let's go over this one. Is there any value in reversing this study and asking for the cost of the other energy sources? For example, the externalities of natural gas, etc. Karl did answer that a little bit in the chat. I don't know if you guys, anybody wanted to expand on that or tell the audience your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I just point out, this is, for sort of basic environmental reading, Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons explains, this thing, we've got to fix this. Somebody is taking advantage on one side or the other when externalities are left out of the equation. And for the first 20 years that I was in the business, we focused on trying to add on to that, the cost, the recognition of the environmental damage. But I will point out that from a political perspective, as I said in my note in the chat, from a political perspective, people don't like the idea of taxes, and the vast majority of us are still getting our electricity from, polluting resources. Which means that such a tax would go everywhere. It'd be a small amount, and there is virtue in carbon taxes as economic theory. But the idea of value analysis is to come at it from the bottom up and to say, well, okay, I get you, but let's not ignore the added value that these resources bring. As with all human endeavors, we'll probably end up meeting somewhere in the middle. We finally will acknowledge the polluting cost, and it'll be recognized in those in decisions about those kinds of polluters as power plants, and we'll recognize the benefits, and we'll approximate the whole if we push successfully from both sides.
Yeah, so I'd echo all of that, and just point out, as Karl notes, straight carbon fees, while universally recognized as one of the most effective approaches to addressing climate change, are politically very difficult. Here in the Northeast, of course, we have the RGGI program, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is sort of a type of carbon fee, certainly a carbon pricing model that sets a cap on emissions, and then the price derives from auctioning off allowances under that cap. Unfortunately, it's not tied to the cost of externalities, so it's itself a bit of a distortion. The cap itself hasn't really driven any reductions, although here in the Northeast, we're fortunate that independent public policies have in fact done that. But yeah, I mean, I think it would be great to see something like RGGI actually having a more active impact on reducing emissions and transitioning to a cleaner grid. But that being said, it does generate a lot of revenue that is supporting excellent programs throughout the state, including energy efficiency programs, which help everybody to reduce their energy needs.
Great, thank you guys. Another question from Mark Scully. In lay terms, how does a state like Michigan come up with a value of 24 cents and we get 14? Anybody speak to that?
Which state was that?
Michigan.
Oh yeah, so I'm a witness in that case, which is going on right now. That what's remarkable about the 24 cents in the Michigan study is that it's not a value of solar analysis. We have 3 witnesses, including me, who testified about value of solar, but that analysis is strictly from the cost of service data, that cost plus data that the utility submits in order to raise its rates. It does not include value components like avoided carbon emissions, voided, NOx and SOx, and other kinds of emissions. It is strictly a calculation based on the data. What's happened is that advocates gaining, and I cannot claim credit for this, his work was done by a wonderful guy from the Solar Energy Industry Association, but we're gaining the same capability with the modeling tools if we can get the data. So we submitted extensive discovery requests, and we got hourly data from the smart meters of what customers use in consumers' energy service territory. And Lucas was able to analyze that and show that not only do solar customers cost significantly less to serve, about almost 3 cents of that 24 cents, but that the value they provide by exporting energy on an occasional basis made the other 20 cents worth of value. Because, hey, in an air conditioner dominated environment, and unfortunately in a warming world, we're in air conditioning dominated environments, a nice coincidence between solar operation and high costs of the grid, meaning that when solar is working overtime, it's saving money for everyone. So that's just a great number. In Maine, where they did calculate those added externality values, the rate was 33 cents. So, it seems abundantly clear to people like me that customers who invest in solar are voluntarily subsidizing everyone else when all they get is net metering.
Yeah, great points. Thank you for that. You're a witness. That makes you're implicated. So we've been talking a lot about the benefits and value of solar. We have 2 folks here, Deb Mosher-Dunn, who is actually advocating to protect Oswegatchie Hills, some land along the Niantic River, and she's done great work there. And then also Amy Velasquez. They have similar questions. So their question is, do we have to cut down a forest of trees to get solar? Or should we focus on putting it on buildings, large buildings, like you mentioned, a Walmart earlier, or over polluted land, over parking lots? Do you guys have anything to add about that, the juxtaposition of environment versus clean energy?
Yeah, if you're really bored, back in 2000 and something or other, when was it? 2001, at Rocky Mountain Institute, we published a book. You can read it free online. It's called Small is Profitable. And we documented the 200 and some different ways in which right-sized energy resources are better economically, operationally, from an engineering and financial standpoint. But if I had to give you one big takeaway, the thing that's amazing about distributed energy resources is they can be sized for the task. They do not have to be overbuilt, which also means they can be sized for the habitat. And very, very importantly, they can be sized for the benefits. So you can start thinking about getting polluting sources of energy out of urban environments where low-income kids are breathing noxious fumes. If you start talking about solarizing transportation and putting solar electricity into the batteries of buses and trucks and vehicles that are in those urban areas, we can start delivering solutions right to where it's needed. So we should not build 800 megawatt solar plants in Connecticut. I've been driven through, bicycled through a lot of Connecticut. I don't know of any 800 megawatt sites, but I know tons of 8 kilowatt sites, or 800 watt sites, or 8 megawatt sites that are available. And we can grow by chunking. And by the way, that means the jobs and the tax revenues and the other benefits are broadly distributed throughout the state as well.
Yeah, and if I could just tag on at
Sure.
the end of that, I mean, it's one reason why I think that, I mean, obviously rooftop solar has to be part of the solution. Is you don't want to be cutting down large swaths of forest. Sure, in my home state of Utah, put an 800 megawatt facility out in the desert that where it's getting great sun and use it for there. But like, we need to make sure that the land that is already developed is being fully utilized, and that means solar and storage on site. And like Karl said, you can right size it for the need, for the customer, for the location. And so that was one of the problems early on back in 2018 when they first had the legislation to phase out net metering. DEEP at the time was primarily looking at what is the lowest cost resource, with kind of ignoring a lot of the other implications. And they were saying, oh, it's large scale solar. Let's just do a lot more large scale solar. Small scale solar is too expensive. There's this cost shift, without quantifying it, and that was their argument of why they didn't think we needed as much rooftop solar. And so I hope that has started to shift in the state, but it's, I don't think that you get to having broad access for solar and fully realizing all the benefits if you keep following a centralized model of large projects and having to, run transmission lines, to load. That's just not a smart way to upgrade our grid.
Right. Thanks so much for answering those questions. Is there anyone else that has a question? I'm not seeing any hands raised, and the chat is quiet. So I think at that, we will call it a day. And again, I thank our panelists and all of you for joining us. I know I've learned a lot. So I will take this and share it with my friends and my legislators and PURA. And we will definitely send out that action alert again, or not again, when it's written, probably in the next few weeks. And well, we have one more question. Do you guys have time for one more question, or do you want to head out? We'll do one more. What impact, this is a good one. What impact do carbon fees have on the poor? Are low-income individuals overly burdened by carbon fees?
So I know Karl answered that in the chat, and let him expand on it. But I mean, I think the basic point to make there is one really needs to look at how the revenue from those carbon fees is distributed. So yes, a carbon fee will have a price impact on the resources that are being taxed. So it may mean higher energy prices, but there's revenue that the political governmental body, the state, is getting, and it's very easy to offset those regressive impacts with a carbon fee. So I think it is certainly something that anyone designing such a program needs to be cognizant of, but I think the solution is relatively simple.
Yeah, and this is Karl. I'll just pile on and say, this is a fundamental debate issue. First of all, we should address energy burden, right? We should understand what the household energy burdens are. Second of all, we need to not get suckered into a conversation just about rates. Look, if I was a steel mill, I'd care about rates. Tiny changes in rates, for my electricity changed the profitability of my business. But what we really care about is bills, which is usage times the rate. And with energy efficiency being so well proven and so much energy efficiency potential still out there, we've got to focus on bills and use both sides of the equation. Dick Cheney, when he was vice president, famously said, we can't conserve our way to energy sufficiency. And it sounded cute, and it was completely wrong. We've got enough energy resources in this country, renewable all over, that if we conserved our energy, we would actually be able to live on our renewable, carbon-free resources plenty. I've run 3 different green building programs in my life at different places around the country. I have yet to walk into a building that could not have its energy use reduced by 50%, because the technology keeps getting better and the opportunities for saving. And if you cut the use by 50%, in a poor person's home, in a rich person's home, in a business, then you've cut the cost of solarizing that home by 50% too.
Go ahead, Kyle.
And yeah, just to add on to that, I mean, definitely considering the energy burden and the utility bills of low and moderate income households is really important. And that's one part of the RCIP incentive program is it requires you to get a home energy audit. And I think that's a great step because it allows you to have a smaller solar system if you can make those energy efficiency improvements, which are oftentimes fully covered or at very low cost. And so I think that's a really big piece. And then additionally, there's in the RCIP program, there's a low and moderate income adder for those households to help it make it even more affordable. And we think that that's a very important aspect. I think that there needs to be more done on that front to improve the outreach. And any new program, whether it's the tariff program or a storage program, there needs to be a lot of considerations of how do you expand the access to everyone so that they can fully realize these benefits. And it's something the industry has struggled with, especially when costs were higher, but now that costs are more within reach. I think it's always an evolving part of the industry because there's just a lot of challenges associated with it, with how do you reach renters, community solar, how do you overcome financing issues, and so there's a lot that goes into it and added costs, and so having support from the state level is really important there.
Great, thank you guys. Yeah, Alicia Dolce just wrote in the chat. I was going to say the same thing. The cheapest energy is the energy that we don't use. That's the best advice I think any of us could have. So get your energy audits if you haven't. Again, I want to thank Charles, Karl, Kyle, and Sena for a great conversation. Thanks all of you for joining us. And we will be in touch with the PURA action alert and some more information for everybody. I wish everybody a great weekend. Stay cool.